Welcome to Insane History. I'm Graham Yorston, and today I'm at the grottos of Catullus in Sirmione in northern Italy. To find out more about Gaius Valerius Catullus, author of passionate love poems, tragic elegies in remembrance of his dead brother, risky send-ups of politicians, and stinging attacks on his rivals. Catullus is one of the most famous poets of antiquity and has been called by some the first psychologist, because of his ability to capture the full range of human emotions in a way that had not really been attempted before, and which had a profound effect on all subsequent poets. He is perhaps most famous for his racy love poems, but his surviving corpus of 116 carmina, or songs, some just a couple of lines long, with others extending to over 400, is a fascinating body of work that brings to life the richness, complexity and raunchiness of ancient Rome like nothing else. Catullus was also the first to use the popular word for kiss, basio, in formal writing, and it is this word that is still used in Romance languages across the world to this day, although I gather it also means a little more in French. And it was Catullus who made it okay for poets to talk about love and desire and sex, writing whole poems about kissing, as well as some pretty explicit stuff that until not so long ago, most editions left untranslated or omitted entirely. But we know very little about his life. What few facts there are have been pieced together from autobiographical elements in his writing and scattered references by other ancient authors, which are full of contradictions and uncertainties. We know he was born sometime around 84 BCE to a leading family of Verona, of the equestrian or second rank of Roman aristocracy. At this point, Verona was a large trading city in the province of Cisalpine Gaul on the northern border of Italy. It was a difficult and dangerous time in Roman politics. Following years of foreign and civil wars, the Senate appointed Sulla as dictator.
Sulla, to the infamy of his name, to the utter damnation of his line.
Sulla then went on a rampage of brutal reprisals against those who had supported his rivals. Up to 1,500 nobles were executed without trial, and their property proscribed or confiscated in a systematic purge which went on for months. It was a reign of terror in which no one was safe. But away from the carnage in Rome, life was a little simpler, and in one of his poems Catullus describes a happy homecoming to the family villa at Sirmio, jewel of islands and peninsulas as he calls it, modern-day Sirmione on Lake Garda, 20 miles from Verona. And after the rediscovery of his work in the Renaissance, his name became attached to the ancient ruins of Sirmione, which were heavily overgrown and appeared to be dotted with caves and grottos. In fact, the site was a large villa complex and olive grove, and it probably had no connection with Catullus's family at all. The villa today, despite being extensively quarried for stone in the Middle Ages, remains an impressive site, jutting out at the tip of a peninsula into Italy's largest lake. It is the most important residential complex in northern Italy, and was one of the inspirations for Andrea Palladio as he was formulating his ideas on transforming architecture with his neoclassical Palladian style. But just as the ruins were long neglected, the poetry of Catullus was lost for centuries, until a manuscript of his poems was found in a library in Verona in 1305. This later went astray, but fortunately it had been copied, and this manuscript survives in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. As, otherwise, Catullus would have been just another anonymous Roman name. Some of his poems allude to him living a life of poverty, but his father, Valerius, was important and wealthy enough to have been on friendly terms with Julius Caesar, as he was rising to power, and Caesar would stay with him at one of his villas whenever business took him north, and it is quite possible that Catullus met him on these occasions. But he may already have left the paternal home to make his fortune in Rome, the provinces being no place for a writer who wanted to do something new and push against the established literary conventions. He began young, writing his first verses at the age of 15, and he tells us that this is also when he discovered the pleasures of the flesh. In Rome, he mixed in artistic circles and was friends with fellow poets and historians. He describes his drinking, carousing, his falling out and making up, and his bitter rivalries with his friends over art and their ever-changing love interests, in a way that still seemed fresh and human and often hilarious. Prudish Victorian commentators, however, dismissed these poems and spoke about how he plunged himself into dissipation and extravagance and fell into great poverty. As well as his friends, Catullus also refers to some very prominent people in Roman society in his poetry, including the orator and statesman Cicero, Julius Caesar, and Pompey the Great. In one angry poem, he criticises Mamurra, who he dubs Mentula, or Dick, one of Caesar's commanders in his campaigns in Spain, Gaul and Britain, accusing him of bedding every woman and making himself rich and then squandering it all through gambling. Catullus bemoans the lack of higher purpose in his actions, and as everyone would have known that Caesar was Mamurra's supporter, the poet's biting words would have been understood as a rebuke against Caesar himself and the whole Roman elite who tolerated such base and venal exploitation. The historian Suetonius tells us that Caesar knew of Catullus's lampoons and that he believed they left a permanent stain on his reputation. He also tells us that when Catullus apologised, Caesar invited him to dinner the very same day, with the implication that the great Caesar was magnanimous enough to forgive the brash young poet. But Suetonius was writing almost 200 years later, and I wonder if the meal was as friendly and forgiving as Suetonius suggests. In his early 20s, Catullus travelled to Bithynia in modern-day northern Turkey on the staff of the praetor Gaius Memmius. Bithynia had been a nominally independent kingdom, but following the death of Nicomedes IV, the same King Nicomedes who had entertained a young Julius Caesar, it had been incorporated into the Republic as a province. Catullus hoped to make his fortune in the east, but singularly failed to do so, and returned disappointed after a year, passing by his brother's tomb near Troy to pay his respects, recording his feelings in a series of moving poems. Back in Rome, he returns to his former life of partying and falling in love. He names several women as the object of his affections, along with the occasional man. But it is his poems addressed to a woman he calls Lesbia, for which he is most famous. Lesbia has been identified as Clodella Metelli, a sophisticated woman from a patrician family 10 years older than the poet, and wife to Quintus Caecilius Metellus Celer, an important politician who was governor of Catullus's home province of Cisalpine Gaul for a while, and later consul, the highest elected office of the Roman Republic. In 26 of his poems, he describes his complicated relationship with Lesbia, sometimes using the name he chose for her, echoing the island of Lesbos, home of the Greek poetess Sappho, sometimes as my girl, my woman, my fair goddess, my life, but sometimes comparing her cruel heart and loathsome mind to the spawn of a Libyan lioness and the man-eating monster of the depths, Scylla. He writes about the different phases of their affair, his initial infatuation and euphoria, the beginnings of doubts about her fidelity, the torment of seeing her in the arms of others, at least 5, possibly including her own brother, their separations, and his devastation at their parting. Give me 1,000 kisses, and then 100, then another 1,000, then a second 100, then another 1,000 without resting, then 100. Then, when we have made many thousands, we will confuse the count, so that no one can cast an evil eye on us through knowing the number of our kisses. That was written when it was going well, but Clodia had a scandalous reputation even by Roman standards, and there were suspicions that she might have had a hand in her husband's mysterious death to go off with a younger man, Rufus, whom Catullus ridicules for his smelly armpits. In Odi et amo, I hate and I love, he manages to encapsulate the pain that love can bring in an epigram of just 2 lines. I hate and I love. Why do I do this, perhaps you ask? I know not, but I feel it happening and I am tortured. His passion for Lesbia is unwavering, and her taking of other lovers only intensifies his feelings, which he immortalizes in his poetry, displaying great emotional depth and psychological insight. Before Catullus, poetry in Rome was largely written by educated Greeks, penning dull epics of the unmemorable deeds of wealthy patrons. Catullus didn't need patronage and was free to write about what he wanted: love, sex, smelly armpits, the moral corruption of the elite, stolen napkins, and his lost brother. He and a group of other new poets played an essential role in the development of Roman literature, influencing Ovid, Horace, and Virgil, and creating the idea of the professional artist, unfettered by the restrictions of conventionality. We know that Catullus was celebrated during his life, as well as being censured, but just as we cannot be sure of the year of his birth, we cannot say for certain in which year he died, or anything about the circumstances of his passing. Other than that, it was sometime around 54 BCE, and that he was still only 30 years of age. And when he was gone, unlike the writings of the poets who came after, Catullus's work disappeared for over 1,000 years, until the fortuitous discovery of the Verona manuscript gave his poetry a second life, each subsequent age finding something new and relevant in his verse. At first he was quoted for his moral pronouncements. In the Renaissance he was known as the master of wit and brevity. John Milton praised his satirical sharpness and naked plainness. For the Romantic era he was a natural poet, and in the 20th century he was seen as a lyricist who poured forth his heart to himself, or to no one. There are, of course, psychoanalytic interpretations of Catullus's poetry, especially his Lesbia infatuation, and his strange poem 63, about the self-castration and subsequent lament of Attis, a priest of the mother goddess Cybele. But personally, I don't find these add much. Catullus has also inspired countless musicians and composers over the years. A favourite of mine is Carl Orff's Catullus Carmina, his follow-up to Carmina Burana that focuses on the Lesbia poems. And although he wrote more than 2,000 years ago, Catullus's poetry remains popular today because he seems modern, compelling and relevant. If you don't know it, do take a look. They're easily available on the internet, but try to find modern translations, as the older ones tended to leave out anything they considered unworthy. Catullus displays great psychological insight into the joy and pain that love can bring, the sorrow of loss, and the sweet comforts of homecoming. Does that make him a psychologist? Probably not. But for his refocusing of the stuff of poetry onto the inner world of the ordinary mortal, rather than the epic deeds of the great and good, I think he deserves to be celebrated. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye for now.